thing. This represents the weight mass of the uranium, which it was created because of the atomic bombing and because of the burning combustion of the uranium because of the bombing. That's 800 grams. So this weight of uranium, very small, but when that is exploded as an atomic bomb, then that destroyed the city of Hiroshima. It's a tremendous energy and power. When I learned about that, the nuclear power is just tremendous. Of course, we should not use it for the purpose of nuclear bombs, but if we can use it for peaceful purposes for the humanity, that would be really good. That was the belief that I had. So when I go to the university, I chose this nuclear engineering, atomic engineering. And what was the nuclear power that I thought would be ideal and that I dreamed about? So you see this very large red rectangular shape. This is the weight of uranium that is combusted in the one reactor of nuclear power plant of 1 million kilowatts, which is the standard size right now. And if it runs for a year, 1 ton of uranium is combusted. And so the nuclear power plant is something that you have to burn this much of uranium, and otherwise it cannot be run. So just one reactor will need this much of uranium in 1 year. That means that the uranium in all the world, in all parts of the world, will be depleted very soon. That's what I thought. The Japanese government has promoted the nuclear power because that's going to be the future energy. And once we have run out of the fossil fuels, then we will need the nuclear power. And this promotion has been going on even now, but that is a complete lie. And the uranium, we do not have uranium as much as we have in terms of the fossil fuels. So before the depletion of fossil fuels, uranium will be depleted. So the 800 grams of uranium was combusted. That means that the 800 grams of deadly ashes were created. So in a similar vein, 1 ton of uranium, when combusted, then that will produce the deadly ashes. So the more than 1,000 Hiroshima-type bombs would be combusted in one reactor in 1 year. That's what the nuclear power plant is. And the machinery will break. Even if we humans want it not to break, but it does break and it has accidents, that's quite natural. Nuclear power plant is also a type of machinery. So I was concerned that there would be a major accident someday. So I thought that we have to stop nuclear power before it will have a very severe accident. So I made a complete shift in my thinking. So I have spent my last 50 years in order to stop the nuclear power. So what was the thinking of those who promoted nuclear power? They thought that the major accident will not happen if we put the very heavy weight on top of the reactor, and then major accidents will not occur if we continue to build up the improvements. But they were also afraid of the possibility of nuclear accidents. So they made a major decision. That is the decision not to build nuclear power plants in heavily populated areas. So this map of Japan shows where the nuclear power plants are located in Japan. The red circles represent the nuclear power plants. The first one was built in Ibaraki Prefecture in Tokai Village, and soon after, the Tsuruga and Mihama in the Wakasa Bay, and that was followed by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And all over Japan, nuclear power plants were built. And Onagawa, which is just north of Fukushima Daiichi, in the Miyagi Prefecture in the Osaka Peninsula, and in the south, Fukushima Daini. And passing through the Tokyo, there is one in Hamaoka and Ikata and Genkai and Shimane and the Takahama and Oi in Wakasa Bay and the Noto Peninsula Shika and the Kashiwazaki Kariwa in Niigata and also Higashidori in the Shimokuta Peninsula and the Tomari in Hokkaido. And before the Fukushima Daiichi accident, Japan had a plan to further build 2 more, and one is in Oma at the very end of the tip of the Shimokuta Peninsula, and then the other one in Sendai in Kagoshima. And the TEPCO did have a plan to build a new nuclear power plant, that is the Higashidori. Right now, Tohoku Electric Power Company is running 1 reactor, but the Tokyo Electric Power Company had a plan to build a new one over there. As you can see from the map, these nuclear power plants are not built in Tokyo or Osaka and Nagoya, far from those population centers. In addition, and the TEPCO had a plan to build the Higashidori nuclear power plant and will bring the generated power through the power lines all the way to Tokyo. So the big cities benefit from the nuclear power plants. And if the big cities decide to also take the risks of generating such power, then that's one way of thinking. However, the people living in big cities do not want and decided not to build nuclear power plants because they had concerns about nuclear power plants. And this is very unfair and unjust decision. And it should not have been taken. And it's not a question of whether we have enough electricity and power or not, but it doesn't matter because this is a very unfair and unjust thing. And why the Japanese people don't realize that. But unfortunately, many people did not realize this. And what we have right now is this. And of course, this was all conducted under the government of the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. 57 nuclear reactors were built all over Japan. All of them were built under the government of LDP. LDP said that the nuclear power plants were safe. But unfortunately, Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant had this accident exactly 10 years ago today. And in that accident, how much of the radioactive materials were emitted in the environment? So please take a look at this slide. I want you to take a look at these numbers, which was reported by IAEA, which is an international atomic energy agency, and they prepared a report about how much of radioactivity was emitted in the environment. And they have very detailed numbers. And then I take the number about the amount of the cesium-137 which was released in the atmosphere. The unit of cesium-137 is becquerel. I think you had never heard of this before, the accident of Fukushima, but there are different units for things. For example, if it's a length, centimeter, the meter, and the kilometer, and when it comes to weight, and grams, and kilograms, and tons. And likewise, the radioactivity unit is becquerel. So this is a rule. You just have to remember it. And lower left, you will see this yellow box, small one, and this represents the Hiroshima bomb 76 years ago. It was dropped, and with a mushroom cloud, cesium-137 was released, and that was the 8.9 multiplied by the 10 to the power of 13. But you just see this small box, and that represents the amount of cesium-137. But when it comes to how much was released from the Fukushima Daiichi accident, what the Japanese government says is this. So 10 years ago, on March 11th, reactor number 1 and 2 and 3 were up and running. And because of the massive earthquake and the massive tsunami hit the nuclear power plant, they lost all the power. It's called blackout, and they couldn't do anything else before the meltdown occurred.
And the radiation was spread around. Just for the first unit, 7 or 8 times the radiation that had come from the Hiroshima nuke was scattered. When we combine the radiation from units 1, 2, 3, the total amount of cesium-137 emitted was 1.5 times 10 to the 16th power, according to our government. This amount is equivalent to 168 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima. Even one atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was really terrifying, but the equivalent of 168 atomic bombs, radiation was spread out into the environment, according to the government. It was not only in the air. From the very day of the accident, radiation was flowing into the ocean as well. Even now, the contaminated water is flowing underground within the underground water. So the Fukushima nuclear accident polluted the air and the ocean. If we combine the total radiation from both, it would be several hundred times the amount of radiation from the Hiroshima bomb, maybe even more than 1,000 times the radiation of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. And that leakage of radiation continues to this day without being under control. So what happened to the air, the radiation that was emitted into the air? It flows in through the wind around. This shows how a map of how the radiation contaminated the land. I didn't make this. This is a map that the Japanese government made. The first power plant of Fukushima power plant was on the Pacific coast. The accident occurred, and the radioactive substances were emitted into the air. As you know, Japan is in the northern hemisphere in the temperate region, and there are seasonal winds that are quite strong blowing. These are westward winds. The radiation from the Fukushima plant, if it went high into the air, was carried by these winds to the Pacific Ocean. However, but on the surface ground, there was not only the west wind. There was some days the wind was a southerly wind, a easterly wind, or a westerly wind. So a vast area in Tohoku and Kanto region was contaminated by radiation, and that was shown on this map made by the government. There was a northerly wind shortly after the accident, so the radiation went southward towards the so-called Hamadori area in Fukushima. When you go a little bit south, you get to the border with Ibaraki Prefecture, but there's no boundary for radiation. So the radiation went beyond the boundary and went in a polluted Ibaraki Prefecture. At one time, there was a cloud of the deadly ash over the Pacific Ocean. But after that, it went over the land, and it contaminated an area around Kasumigaura in Chiba Prefecture, just outside of Tokyo, contaminating it badly. And after some time, there was a southeasterly wind carrying the clouds of pollution northwest. You can see the areas in red. Very heavy contamination occurred there. The red areas have 3 million becquerels per square kilometer, according to the Japanese government. The green areas around it also have 600,000 becquerels per square kilometer. It was very intense contamination. These are places where people could not at all live, so the people were mandatorily required to evacuate. As Sato-san spoke a while ago, even 40 or 50 kilometers away from the plant is the Iitate village. It was said to be one of the most beautiful villages in Japan, but it was polluted very terribly. After a month or so, people were told they must evacuate from there. The entire population was required mandatorily to leave Iitate village. But that was not the end of the problem of the radiation. You see a blue belt going north and south in Fukushima. That is the so-called Nakadori region of Fukushima. On the east, there's the Abuka Mountains, and there's an Owen range on the west. So this area is a flat area between two mountain ranges. It is quite warm and very comfortable to live in. So most of the large cities are in the Nakadori region. There's Date City, Fukushima City, Nihonmatsu City, Koriyama City, Sukagawa City, and Shirakawa City in those regions. And many people live there. And a cloud of irradiation spread along that whole Nakadori area valley. That area is connected to the northern part of Kanto region, including Gunma Prefecture. I live in Nagano Prefecture now, but at the border between Gunma and Fukushima, there is Mount Asama and other high mountains. So the clouds that came to the mountain didn't go over the mountain, but it wrapped around, polluting the west of Gunma, the west of Saitama, and also the Okutama region of Tokyo. Up to now, I've been using the word contamination just as one word, but let me give you some more specific figures. The West Gunma area is shown in a light blue here. That is a similar level at Aizu in Fukushima, and also in northern Ibaraki, the southern Iwate, north of Chiba, and Okutama area of Tokyo, and part of Saitama. And these areas all are at a similar level of pollution. The pollution is between 30,000 and 60,000 becquerels per square kilometer in those areas. But the number may not make much sense to you, so let me give you an example for comparison. Until I used to work at the nuclear lab at Kyoto University. I was running a nuclear plant and handling various types of radiation and doing research. That was my workplace. on a daily basis, I was dealing with radioactive substances and radiation. I've also retired from that job already, but if I was asked if I could do a nuclear radiation accident here, of course people tell me we can't. These experiments with radiation should not be done in places where people are living. That's determined by law. Then where are the experiments done? They're done in what are called radiation-controlled areas, only in such places. And the average public is not allowed to go to radiation-controlled areas. People with a special job like mine to handle radiation only are allowed to go into radiation-controlled areas. But once I go in there, I'm not allowed to even drink water. Of course, I'm not allowed to eat anything either, and must not sleep there either. In a controlled area, there are no toilets either. So it is unthinkable for people to be living in a place that is a radiation-controlled area. And that's where I did work. But I felt uncomfortable there, so I always wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. But at the exit of the controlled area, there was a door, and it was always closed because the fact that I was working within the controlled area means my hands might be contaminated, and my clothes might have been contaminated. If I went out like that, then I would be exposing the normal people to the radiation on me. So when I leave the controlled area, I have to check to make sure that my hands are not dirty, that my clothes are not dirty, that my feet are not dirty. The radiation has to be measured, and only when you pass the criteria will the door open. It's that way now as well. So what is the level it has to come down for the door to go open? It's 40,000 becquerels per square meter. That is the upper limit. If anything is contaminated more than that, it cannot leave the radiation-controlled area. That is defined by Japanese law. It's this sort of a place. In Aizu, the radiation level is between 30,000 to 60,000 becquerels per square meter. So, and the very soil is contaminated at that level. So that area should be a radiation-controlled area, and people should be prohibited from living there. They should be mandatorily evacuated, and that was what the law required previously. But after the Fukushima accident, the accident was so horrible, so people felt the government thought it's impossible to comply with their own laws. So there were a number, if there was even places with 60,000, only places that had intense radiation of more than 60,000 becquerels per square meter were required to evacuate mandatorily. They were told to leave with nothing, with empty hands.
And some of you may have pets, cats and dogs, but they were told not to bring them together. And in Fukushima Prefecture, there were many people whose business was dairy, so they kept the cows, but they also have to abandon them, and they just rode bus with empty hands, and they went to a gymnasium, and then soon they were told to go to the temporary housings, and they were then told to move out of the temporary housing to live in more permanent housings. But they used to have very large families, extended families. However, they were divided into smaller pieces in one family, and the bond in the community was also divided, and they were no longer able to do the business that they used to do. And because of such sufferings, many people thought of taking their own life, and actually some people did take their own lives. But it was not just those areas. These areas populated by millions of people, in those areas which should have been designated as the radiation-controlled areas, but they were abandoned. They were told that they could live in those areas. And in the radiation-controlled area, I could not drink even water, but in such areas, a lot of people were left abandoned. The government said that this is an emergency, so we cannot and we do not have to follow the laws. But those people who are in this room right now would probably know this nuclear emergency has not been lifted yet after 10 years. Now the mass media or the people living here are worried about what will happen to this coronavirus nuclear emergency, whether it's going to be lifted or not. But this nuclear emergency is not lifted yet after 10 years. And this is the illustration drawn by Yugi Misato, and we call it the illustration of red dots. These red dots represent the radiation. You just saw the map created by the Japanese government of contamination. So Fukushima Prefecture and other prefectures surrounding Fukushima are contaminated, so contaminated that they should be designated as radiation-controlled areas. It's a fact that the soil is contaminated. The general public is not allowed in such areas. And even if I go into that area, I cannot even drink water. But in such contaminated soils, lands, people are left contaminated, so contaminated that they should be designated as radiation-controlled areas. It's a fact that the soil is contaminated. The general public is not allowed in such areas. And even if I go into that area, I cannot even drink water. But in such contaminated soils, lands, people are left abandoned. And 10 years have passed since then. I sometimes go to Fukushima Prefecture, and I truly wish that we can see the radiation, because if the radiation is visible, then we can send out the alarms to people. But it's not visible. And people just do not realize that they live in contaminated areas. And that situation continues even till today. And this nuclear emergency, what will become of it, you may wonder. If general public break laws, then the state, the government will punish them. And the government will tell us that the government will punish those who break the law, so you can live in security. But then, in Japan, we have a law that general public should not be exposed to radiation of 1 millisievert or more in a year. And as I told you, anything that is contaminated on the level of 40,000 becquerels per square meter from the radiation-controlled area should not be taken out of the area. We have that law. However, based on the emergency declaration, the government continued to disregard the compliance with laws and regulations, and they kept issuing the special measures law and keep abandoning the people in the last 10 years. The cesium-137, which is a major component of the contamination, its half-life is 30 years. So even 100 years pass, but still the contamination levels is only 1/10. So in 100 years, this cesium-137 will be 1/10. However, some areas are contaminated to the level of 3 million becquerel per square meter. So 100 years from now, I will be dead, and you will also be dead. And the babies who are born today will probably be dead 100 years from now. But still, Japan cannot lift the emergency declaration and nuclear emergency declaration. We are living in such a dire state. So we have such tremendous and very severe damage and the victims. So who are the perpetrators? In Japan, it was the government who promoted the nuclear power and the peaceful use of the nuclear power. And the government enacted the Nuclear Damage Compensation Law and the Electricity Business Act. And the state created a system in which any business which is involved in the nuclear business can make a lot of profits. And the Mitsubishi, Hitachi, Toshiba, and many other big nuclear industries rush to this nuclear power business for profits, and the general contractors and small and medium-sized companies and the trade unions and mass media and the justice system and academia all created this big structural power, which is called atomic village. And they involved everyone and everything in this. And when building a nuclear power plant, the safety must be considered as a priority. So the government created the guidelines for nuclear reactor site evaluation in order to check if the site for nuclear power plants would be okay. However, they claim that they also thought about the possibilities of severe accidents and the hypothetical accidents and so forth, but still they imagined that the container vessels will never be broken. And that is equivalent to expecting no severe accidents will not occur. So they ignored any possibility of accidents which would lead to the breakup of the container vessel as unsuitable. And however expensive equipment will be installed to the nuclear power plants, however, I think that we have to think about the theoretical possibilities of accidents will be occurring if we cannot exclude such a possibilities. However, they excluded that possibilities and they did not anticipate any such severe accidents will occur. And then the government had already warned that there might be major tsunami hitting the area of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident, but the TEPCO ignored that alarm. And then eventually they had this severe accident. And after the accident happened, what they said was that this was not anticipated. And also the court of Japan also agreed to TEPCO to judge that such an accident, major accident, was unanticipated. So the court was part of this atomic village even after the accident happened. And this organization survived, the organization that supported this entire structure promoting the nuclear power plant.
So the myth that nuclear power is safe was denied by a fact on March 11th, 2011. But those who were responsible for that accident, the highly educated elites in the nuclear power village, were not punished. None of them. There weren't even any people who tried to take responsibility on their own. They're living on without any suffering, whereas the people in the contaminated areas are suffering. And these perpetrators are now saying that even exposure to radiation is safe. They're creating a new myth, working with educators and mass media. Up to 20 millisieverts a year of radiation is no problem, so it's safe to live in such an environment, they're saying. 20 millisieverts for a year is the level that the maximum limit that I was allowed to be exposed when I was working in the reactors. Since I was being paid to work in radiated areas, I was required to tolerate a certain level of radiation. But now, this same criterion is being applied to the ordinary people who gain not a penny from the nuclear industry. And it's being applied even to the children who are sensitive to radiation more than adults. They're applying the same criteria to the ordinary people that was normally applied only to people working in contamination areas. I think this is a terrible crime. Up to now, we've used the term the nuclear power village, but I think a more appropriate term is the nuclear power mafia. And I think they all deserve to go to prison. Unfortunately, that hasn't been achieved. These people have carried out an inconceivable crime, and they're still carrying on as if nothing happened in great comfort and are controlling this country. South of the Fukushima power plant, there's an area called Hamadori along the coast, north and south. Would you like to know what is happening there now? The Fukushima Innovation Coast project is now underway there. Massive construction is underway now. Huge buildings and factories, etc., are being built there one after another. The workers there are the nuclear industries, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, and Toshiba, as well as the general contractors such as Kashima, Obayashi, and Kumagaya. They're getting huge orders and making massive profits there. They made a lot of money when the nuclear power plants were built. When the Fukushima accident occurred, they made money from decontamination work as well. Especially the general contractors got all of the business for decontamination and divvied out the work to subcontractors. And now, under the name of reconstruction, these same companies are making huge profits. On the other hand, the pain of the victims is continuing and deepening. The part of the Innovation Coast project was the establishment of a memorial museum for the earthquake and the nuclear disaster. It was built at a budget of more than 5 billion yen and opened September last year. There are various displays in this museum to commemorate the earthquake and the nuclear accident, but there isn't a word mentioned about victims or victimization. And of course, not a word about the perpetrators of this disaster. And the guides at the museum explain to the people about the exhibits. But the guides at the museum are prohibited from saying a single word of criticism towards TEPCO. They are not allowed to criticize the government either. That is the sort of museum that has been built with massive public funds. they're trying to, it seems they're not trying to, remember about the Fukushima plant, but trying to forget it, actually. Recovery of Fukushima ought to mean recovery of the people who live there. It's unthinkable that the perpetrators of this crime are going to make money off of it. Massive areas in Tohoku and Kanto ought to be radiation-controlled zones. That's how contaminated they are. Even a small amount of radiation can harm the health. That is known very well by academia. But the government has been requiring the people who were required to evacuate or voluntarily evacuated to move back. Until 2017, the evacuees were getting support for alternative housing, but that support was cut off. And until March of 2019, some local governments were continuing to provide support for the temporary housing, but that support was ended 2 years ago. The victims have been pushed into the despair since they can get no more help for housing. So what is the government doing? The government's saying, why do they have to run away? They're saying many people are still living in Fukushima. So why are you evacuating? You are acting selfish, they're saying. They're saying, if you're going to be so selfish, you should pay twice the normal rent. And there are even cases where some residents were being sued for complaining. Their suffering has continued for 10 years, and they're not seeing any recovery. So many of the victims have become totally exhausted, and they've been driven to a point where they have to give up and accept living in a contaminated area. That's why they have no choice but to think about rebuilding their hometown. And it's not possible for people to live in constant fear. Such people are forced to live in a contaminated environment, try to forget about the contamination. And for better or worse, they cannot see or smell the radiation. And the government is urging them to forget about the radiation also. In Fukushima, the rebuilding is given top priority. So at the school lunches, they're using food products made in Fukushima, and they're trying to promote how safe the food of Fukushima is by feeding it to the children. There's also National Road number 6 going along Hamadori. In some regions, motorcycles are not allowed to drive there, and cars are required to keep their windows closed and not allowed to stop because the radiation is so high. But school children have been mobilized to do cleaning along the side of this highly contaminated road, and they're promoting how safe, supposedly, the region is. We can understand the people wanting to feel safe, but they shouldn't victimize the children in the process. Many parents are concerned about the health of their children. Even during the summer, if they could send their children to play outside, it would be nice, they feel. But people say such activities will be a nuisance to the efforts for reconstruction, and people are blamed. In Fukushima, it's a taboo to even mention about radiation. So what needs to be done? The people who were forced to leave their hometowns, of course, are victims. The people who were left without help in contaminated areas were also victims. People who voluntarily evacuated, knowing that it might completely damage their livelihoods and lives, are also victims. The radiation-contaminated food is going on into our supply chain, and many of us are eating it. So everybody in Japan, in a way, is a victim because we're eating contaminated food. But as was just explained, the perpetrators of this accident have not taken any responsibility. They've been using divide and rule policies to make the victims fight against each other, and they're trying to promote nuclear power again. They want to restart the the plants that have stopped. They want to export Japanese nuclear power plants overseas, and they're also thinking of making smaller, supposedly smarter nuclear power plants. So what should we do in this situation? What is important? We need to understand that the victims have been suffering various types of suffering. Rather than blaming each other, the victims need to join forces to fight against the perpetrators. The perpetrators are the nuclear power mafia, a huge power structure centered on the government. But if we don't continue this fight, another disaster is certain to come. We must be aware of that. Let's combine our forces and fight against the perpetrators and stop nuclear power generation in Japan at all costs. I need your support. Please allow me to conclude. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Koide, thank you very much for your talk. Dr. Koide issued a book called The Nuclear Plant Accident Hasn't Ended Yet. We hope you will also read his book, recently published. You can understand his anger and sorrow over this accident written in the pages of that book. So let's give another warm round of applause for Professor Koide.
So, thank you for your wait. So, our advisor of the Federation of Promotion of Zero Nuclear Power and Renewable Energy, Mr. Junichiro Koizumi, and he will have 60 minutes. He always gives a lecture of 90 minutes, but today he has 60 minutes for his lecture. So please welcome Mr. Junichiro Koizumi. Thank you for the introduction. This is Junichiro Koizumi. So this is a conference to promote zero nuclear power and renewable energy. And I have been involved in this organization. And together, we commemorate the 10th anniversary of Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power accident so that we can achieve a society with zero nuclear power plants. And then we can enjoy the natural energy such as wind and the sun, solar, and so that we can build a new country. And I'm sure you all share that the same objective. And I'd like to thank you for your participation. So I have been thinking since the accident. So this is exactly 10 years since then. 10 years ago, I already retired from politics. So around 2:30 in the afternoon, when the accident happened, I was reading a newspaper. And I then felt the motion, the earthquake. Then I thought it was a major earthquake. Then we learned that there was a massive tsunami hitting the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and I decided that I had to do something. So that's why I started this movement towards zero nuclear power. When I was Prime Minister, I believed what Ministry of Economy, Trade, Industry told me, that Japanese nuclear power plants were safe and low cost. It doesn't emit CO2s. It's a clean energy. It is indispensable for Japanese economic development. And we need it. That's what I was told. And I believed in it. But since that accident 10 years ago, I began to read about nuclear power plants. And today, we have Professor Koide with us, who has been long studying nuclear power, who pointed out the danger of nuclear power since many decades ago. And I realized that what I believed was wrong. The belief that nuclear power was necessary for Japan, that idea was wrong. I realized that. So not correcting the mistake is a mistake. And you should not refrain from correcting the mistakes. That's the adage that I remembered when I realized that I had made a mistake and I have to correct it. And that is why I have been involved in this zero nuclear power movement. Luckily, with the support of so many people, although I was already retired, but the president of Jonan Credit Bank Yoshihara-san, yes, I was trying to remember his name. Actually, I'm seeing his face in front of me, and I know, of course, his face, but his name just, I just couldn't remember his name. So, Mr. Yoshihara is one of my colleagues working with me, and Yoshihara-san said that although there are so many people who are for the nuclear power because he is running the credit bank, but he was resoluted that he had to do this to stop zero nuclear. It's not a partisan issue. Recently, the other day, I was with Mr. Khan, who is also former prime minister, to share the press conference. And today, I hear that another former prime minister, Mr. Hatoyama, is going to join us later. So, and it's not a partisan issue. It's not the issue of whether the left or the right. If you are determined that the nuclear power must be abolished, then we are all colleagues. Since the accident, those who are pro-nuclear power so to begin with, Japan experienced Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, so the people of Japan are very sensitive about radiation. And there was a 3 Mile Island accident and Chernobyl accident in the former Soviet Union, and people of those who are for nuclear power in Japan are used to say that we have taken care of all those lessons from those accidents to make our nuclear power plants very safe. However, we had that accident 10 years ago. So we have to correct that situation, I thought. And that is why I continue to do these activities now. But I keenly feel that there is an increasing number of people who are against nuclear power. I'm talking about this because I really feel frustrated that I once believed in this stuff. The talk by the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry that nuclear power is safe and low cost and also clean. But all the three benefits, supposedly the benefits of the nuclear power, were all wrong, I realized. And Mr. Gegami, who is the broadcaster, said these three benefits, major benefits of the nuclear power, are all wrong. And I think at least one of the leaders of the Ministry of the Economy, METI, I'm sure they listened to these talks on TV, but none of them have come to me for complaints. Why? Because what I'm saying is true. They keep telling lies. The METI has got it wrong. And even in Parliament, in National Diet, after this accident, and both the ruling parties and opposition parties unanimously decided to establish the Accident Verification Commission, which was led by the former president of Japan, Science Council of Japan, Professor Dr. Kurokawa, who is in his 80s, I think, but he's very strong still. And the recommendations from this Accident Verification Commission say very clearly that the fundamental cause of the accident was that there used to be the national regulatory authority, who is the supervising regulatory authority, but their position was the power relationship between the NRA and the power companies were opposite. The power company, the NRA, was taken prisoner by the power companies. That's what that recommendation said. And it's that was the fundamental cause for that accident. But nobody reported it. No major media reported it. So the power companies had more power than the NRA. That's what the Verification Commission report said. And that situation continued before the accident. And the accident happened. Although that was caused by the earthquake and tsunami, but it's not a natural disaster. It is a man-made disaster, the Commission report said. Because although they were saying safety first, but actually it was not so. Profitability was prioritized. That's what is clearly said in the report.
We need to correct this situation. In the beginning, Meti said it's safe, inexpensive, and clean. But it wasn't safe, and it's not cheap at all. What is TEPCO saying recently? They're saying there are many victims from that accident. Many of them are still unable to go to their home grounds, and they are evacuated elsewhere. But TEPCO is saying TEPCO cannot pay damages to the victims, and the government must pay for it. And they're saying they're going to have to spend even more money on safety countermeasures than they did before, so they need government subsidies also for that. Eventually, the plants will need to be decommissioned, and that will also be costly, and it might not be possible in 40 years, they're saying. So TEPCO is asking for additional aid from the government for that. And they were saying that it was inexpensive, but the cost continues to be incurred for a very long time, even after the plant is out of service. Still, TEPCO has not given up on nuclear power plants, despite all of these all of its myths being debunked. There are the industrial waste processing companies. These industrial waste processing companies who deal with used electrical appliances, etc., and discard them or process them, are quite numerous in Japan. If you want to make a company to dispose of waste, the waste after making a mess should be required. Any company making polluting products normally is not allowed to make that product unless it secures a place to dispose of the products after disposal. But that has not been required of the nuclear industry, even though their waste is more dangerous than any other kind of industrial waste. There's still no place to dispose the spent nuclear fuel. They've been looking for a place to dispose of it, but no place is willing to accept it. The government is willing to give huge subsidies to any place that would accept a spent fuel processing facility, but not a single local government in Japan has agreed to host that. For that reason, Meto is trying to find a place on their own, but they still cannot find any place. They have plenty of public money to do it. There was a governor of a local government who indicated an interest in accepting a nuclear waste processing site, but the local community opposed it, so he had to give up on it. In most other industries, you're not allowed to even make the product unless you have a place to dispose of the spent product. But the nuclear industry is not required to follow that requirement. Despite not having a place to throw their waste away, they want to proceed with this industry. You've heard of monju, right? The word monju means wisdom. They say if 3 people come together, they have the wisdom of the monju bodhisattva. In 1985, the monju plant was, started construction, and it was completed in 1995. And they thought that this monju would be able to use the spent nuclear fuel as a fuel again. It would be a way to process the spent nuclear fuel and make it into fuel again. That was the goal that Monju plant was made for. It was completed in 1995. And just as they were going to run the nuclear fuel cycle and process the plutonium as fuel again, immediately it had a technical failure. Even after 5 years and 10 years or even 20 years, they still haven't been able to get the Monju plant running again. The experts ultimately gave up on it. They were talking about refurbishing Monju, using new technology, and achieving the reprocessing cycle, but they weren't able to do it. And just 2 years ago, they gave up at last. They officially announced that they had to give up on Monju. Nonetheless, they still haven't given up on nuclear power plants themselves. It's a mystery to me. What in the world is Japan doing? Even though we know it's hopeless, they don't try, they can't give up. It's hard for me to understand that. First of all, the nuclear plants in Fukushima have been broken for a long time. Even if they are to be decommissioned, they have to take out the nuclear fuel inside their melted down reactors. The fuel has to be taken out of there. But the decontamination work around the plant, it can be done wearing protective equipment, but the area where the meltdown had occurred after the explosion, has to be accessed to remove that nuclear fuel. And humans cannot go in there. Even wearing the strongest protective equipment, it's impossible for a human to go into a melted down reactor, which is at high temperature and very, very reactive. You would have to make a robot that could function under high radiation and heat inside a reactor. Japan's cutting technology was used to make such a robot. But as soon as it went in, it broke down. No matter how many times they tried, it failed. That is how difficult it is to clean up the plant in Fukushima. Despite that situation, why don't they give up? The first problem is there's no place to dispose of the spent fuel. In the future, it may be possible I thought it would be possible to have a plant for processing the spent fuel. There's only one country that has such a plant. It's Finland. It's a place called Onkaro, which is a disposal site for spent nuclear fuel. The Onkaro site is more or less complete, so I visited it a few years ago, led by 4 or 5 executives of a nuclear power company. We arrived at Helsinki airport, got off the plane, and took another jet plane an hour to this island where the plant is. They chartered a ship, and we went to Onkaro, an island surrounded by rocky walls where the spent fuel is to be disposed of. It was interesting that there were quite a few people who were going there sort of as tourists also. I thought it would be difficult to make such a facility, even in a place with solid bedrock. There were a lot of visitors there, so there was an observatory where you could look down. There was a space area, an area with 2,000 square meters at a depth of 400 meters below, and you can look down into it. And there was a 10-meter cylindrical tube into which the spent fuel is supposed to be placed, and it will stay there for. It can be kept there for 50,000 to 100,000 years without any leakage. Finland is a land with solid bedrock. I asked them, is it complete? And they said, not yet. They have to do one more exam. They told me to look at the wall. At about 2,000 meters, there is in the stone wall, there was a small black stain in the wall. And I asked, what is that? They said it's due to moisture. There was a stripe of stain on the wall. And after thousands and 10,000s of years, that water could become liquid, evaporated. And that might affect the nuclear waste bent down. After time, that might become liquid and cause effect on the spent fuel. So it's still under inspection. The stuff is to be stored 400 meters underground, but they're concerned about a slight bit of moisture causing problems. I thought it'd be impossible for Japan to have a disposal anywhere, because if you dig 400 meters underground in Japan, you're going to find hot springs anywhere.
So in Japan, it would be impossible to find a site for a disposal site. Finland has 4 reactors, and in Onkaro that I just explained. So in this area, 400 deep underground, 2,000 square meters, but the space is only sufficient for only hosting the spent fuels from 2 reactors. And it so happened to be on the island with a solid bedrock. So they built this disposal for 2 reactors. And that was decided in the Finland parliament. On the basis that they will never introduce spent fuels and nuclear waste from other countries. But they said that they have no plan to build another disposal site. And Finland has only 4. But in Japan, before the accident, 54 reactors we had. without the accident, Japan had a plan to build 100 reactors in total. Of course, they have given up on that. It's a question of reducing the nuclear power plants because they have to deal with this, how to dispose of these nuclear wastes coming from the existing reactors. And so nuclear power was promoted without thinking about where to dispose of. So disposal site, it's a lot more dangerous than industrial waste. And this is a fact, and this fact was known. But even now, nuclear power plants, nuclear power companies have not given up on it. And the Kyushu Electric Power Company has started the Sendai nuclear power plant. But there are these people who are pro nuclear power plant, but the facts are very clear. So we had this accident in March 2011. And in 2013, September, so for about 2 years since the accident until September 2013, and then there were 54 reactors in total, and the 40 out of 54 were always running at any one time to provide power. But then we had that accident, and 2 years since the accident, there was 0 nuclear power plant operating at that point. 0. And during that time, from Hokkaido to Kyushu, there was not a single day of power outage. That means that we were able to prove that we could do it without nuclear power. Now the Kyushu Electric Power Company has started this nuclear power plant in Kyushu down in south. And the other than nuclear power plant, they are now trying to create new energy sources such as wind and solar and the geological and geothermal and so forth. So what the Kyushu Electric Power Company is saying that now we have more renewable sources. So they are telling that you should not produce those new renewable energy sources because if so, then we have to stop the nuclear power. So they are saying, stop the renewable, stop the natural energy sources. And this is pathetic, And because the fact shows that we could do without nuclear power, and we don't have any single day of power outage. And then the one farmer in Chiba Prefecture invented these phrase. I actually visited them some time ago. The solar share. So share solar power for So in the farmland, you put up the poles at the interval of 3 meters. The 2 meter high poles in the farmland, and on top of it, you set up the photovoltaic facilities and equipment. So the photovoltaic, so the solar power and the this crops share the solar power. So solar share is the phrase that they invented. So they get the income from cultivating and selling crops, and also from selling electricity from the solar power. So right now, so that was about the farmland in one prefecture. But in the future, in all over Japan, we can use the rice paddies. And also, put the solar photovoltaic facilities in the rice paddies, then we can produce more solar power. This is not unrealistic at all. And for the 5 years, we experienced no day of power outage without nuclear power. It's not a dream story, and it is not unrealistic. It is realistic. And someday in Japan, well, sooner or later we will have elections in Japan. And if you are to gain power, you have to take into account the opinions of the general public. Otherwise, you cannot maintain your power. So someday, sooner or later, if opposition parties can be united on the anti-nuclear policy and start criticizing the LDP for promoting the nuclear power, then that may happen. It will, such a day will come sooner or later. And I believe such a day will come in Japan too. And Japan used to wage a very wrong war. So 1941, and the former Tokyo Metropolitan Governor, Mr. Inose, wrote about the book, which is titled The Defeat in the Summer of 1941, which is just before the Pacific War started. So in 1941, maybe in around the January, the situation with the United States was already becoming worse. And about 30 intellectuals were gathered to discuss what would happen if Japan went to war with the United States now. And they were instructed to do the study for about 5 months, starting in January, and then would come up with the recommendations to the government. So before all the cabinet members in August in 1941, and those experts who studied that issue of what would happen to Japan if Japan would go to war with the United States, and they made a recommendation, made a report to the cabinet. And the conclusion from that, in August 1941, the experts said that Japan would certainly lose the war if we go to war right now with the U.S. But the government then ignored, disregarded that recommendation, and they would have Pearl Harbor attack in the same year in December, and the rest is the story. And Japan got defeated, and the Tokyo and other cities were a scorched earth. And if you think about it, there is no way Japan can win against the U.S. And the experts also recommended the government that Japan would lose, but that was disregarded. It was just an empty theory. And so the young people in those days had to go to war, and they actually practiced in order to do the suicide bombings. And after all that, Japan got defeated, and since then, we Japanese were resolute that we should never go to war. We should never repeat that mistake.
but we lost the war. This tragic mistake in August of 1941 led Japan into the tragic war. When I read this historical book about this mistake, I realize actually the U.S. was already under war by 1943, fighting against the Nazis. Mr. Inokeme, who was the dean of the Defense University, published this book. Mr. Iokebe. In the midst of the war with Japan, the U.S. won the battle in the West, and they were already thinking how to rebuild Japan after the war. Even while they were fighting Japan and defeating it, they had no intention of destroying Japan. Now that was the great blessing in the tragedy. The U.S. assumed that they were going to win the war, so they were thinking what to do after Japan was defeated, how to rebuild the country. We had been taught that the American soldiers were like demons and ogres, but it turned out differently. Because America won the war, they did not enslave the Japanese. They thought how to make the economy vibrant again. And the U.S. provided various types of aid to Japan, which was crushed by the war. The Japanese were saying, you know, the Americans are ogres, but they started to practically worship the Americans. I don't know if that was good either, but Japan developed, you know, under the protection of the U.S. When we think of this, I think, you know, mistakes do occur in history, but once we make a mistake, we must be sure to never repeat it. We need to learn from the lessons of history and chisel these lessons in our hearts. Looking back on history, I think this way. After the war, Japan developed rapidly with the aid from its former enemy, the U.S. In the post-war period, there were also some crises. There was the oil shock in the 70s. Young people nowadays may not remember about the oil shock. It was in 1973, nearly 50 years ago. The oil shock was due to the situation in the Arab countries. The Arab countries were being fighting against Israel and were being defeated by Israel many times. And they were angry that the countries using the petroleum were prospering, and while the oil producing countries were suffering and always losing out. So the OPEC countries decided to use oil as a weapon. They increased the price of oil from $2 a barrel to about $10 or $11 per barrel. Young people now don't remember, but at the time, I was in my 40s. It was the year after I became an MP for the first term that it was 72 that I was elected, and in 73 that the oil shock occurred, and the price increased from $2 a barrel to $10 a barrel for petroleum. Taichi Sakaya of MITI, who is now in METI, he was in the former Minister of Industry, Trade, and MITI, and Taichi Sakaya published a novel called, you know, Yudan, or getting caught unprepared, and that book became a bestseller. It was about the issue of being caught by surprise by the sudden increase in oil prices. He said the price might increase even to the $40 or $50 a barrel, and it did exceed that. At one time, the price of petroleum went as high as $150 per barrel. And the U.S. started to develop shale gas to counter these moves, because shale gas could be prepared for $40 a barrel. And then the oil-producing countries realized they couldn't sell the gasoline at such a high price. So they stopped their high price strategy and brought the price down to a level that could compete with the shale gas. So now the price has dropped from $150 a barrel to about $40 a barrel, so that to be able to compete with shale gas. In Japan, the markets react very rapidly in the current small world. So when something happens in one part of the world, it has ripple effects throughout the world. This oil crisis was not all bad, actually. It's possible to convert a pinch into an opportunity or chance. Thanks to that oil shock, we realized we can't rely just on imported fossil fuels, and no amount of money could be enough. So prior to after the war, we were using petroleum very freely, thinking it was a limitless resource. Before the war, the Japanese rationed the petroleum products very carefully. But after the oil shock, Japan learned and decided to promote energy efficiency. It was thanks to the oil shock that Japan became a world leader in fuel efficiency technology. Now the oil-producing countries are not able to increase the oil price because there are many competing renewable energy alternatives. But when we look at this situation, we realize Japan has the ability to convert a crisis into an opportunity. Japan developed various types of fuel efficiency technologies thanks to the oil crisis. So Americans started to buy more American cars thanks to the good fuel efficiency. Japanese cars were able to drive further with 1 gallon of gasoline than the large gas guzzlers of the U.S., like a Cadillac. A Cadillac can only run 4 or 5 kilometers with a liter, but a Japanese car could run 20 kilometers per liter. So Japanese cars got exported more and more to U.S., bringing coals to Newcastle, so to speak. So these crises, were converted to an opportunity in terms of technological development because Japan was capable. So it's important for us in Japan to learn from the lessons of the world and apply them. Japanese. One other very important turning point in Japanese history was the de-pegging of the dollar-yen exchange rate. It used to be 360 yen per the dollar. It was a fixed exchange rate. But the U.S. Said it would be made into a floating rate. There was some confusion in the beginning in Japan as well. It led to a skyrocketing, a strong yen, making it harder for Japan to export. It dropped to 280 yen, 250 yen to the dollar, and even below. Since Japan was an export-oriented economy, when we shipped $10,000 worth of goods, when it was 360 yen to the dollar, we would get 3.6 million yen, but when it was down to 200 yen a dollar, it was only 2 million yen that we could earn. So but little by little, the Japanese companies became accustomed to the strong yen. even with a strong yen, I mean, people who were happy for the strong yen would just keep quiet. But the importing companies were able to reduce their procurement costs drastically. What used to cost 3.6 million yen could be purchased for 2 million yen. So the trading companies got accustomed to the strong yen, and there were cases when the importers they could import. They could use a strong yen to import parts and then export the finished products. So little by little, a new balance was emerged, even after the strong yen, though people were complaining about the problems of the strong yen. I was wondering why the yen, which had been 360, the dollar, which had been 3,000 yen, suddenly became 200 yen to the dollar. It seemed like the value of the yen was dropping, but that wasn't it. The yen was becoming stronger.
My constituency is with Yokosuka City, where the U.S. bases are there. And the people who have money wanted to go to the States, but because it was a fixed rate of 360 yen to the dollar, so it was not easy. But there were also people who were running businesses for the U.S. military personnel, and then the people who are running the businesses said they will not sell the dollar at 360 yen, but with 400 yen, then they will sell the dollars. And that was, what was going on in those days. But right now, $1 is about 100 yen, and the people used to say that with stronger yen, the Japanese export business will collapse, but it didn't collapse. So in 1971, the younger people may not remember, but this strong yen was a target of such hype on such. Discussion, a lot of discussions, and we had to explain to general public that why do you say strong yen, although the 200 yen instead of 360 yen per the dollar. So the expert people had to explain. But some people complained that because of the strong yen, they were suffering, but strong yen means that you have to pay 360 yen to buy a product of $1. But now, with the stronger yen, you will only have to pay 200 yen, and that's why you call it strong yen. And with that explanation, then people realize what it means. But now you are accustomed to it. And there was a time when the $1 was about 70 yen, and there was a prediction that it will still go up to or go down to 50 yen per dollar. But now it didn't happen. But in terms of the fluctuations of the exchange rates, Japan has accustomed to such fluctuations, and Japan has abilities to cope with changing times and different situations. And the Japanese people preferences also change. 30 years ago, the U.S. people would ask us why we eat raw fish, because they eat meat. And they don't appreciate fish, not to mention the raw fish. But now, the most liked Japanese food is sushi. So people in different countries would love to eat sushi, raw fish. And there are a lot of sushi restaurants in Tokyo, good sushi restaurants. And when foreign customers come, they will hide their tuna, the best part of the tuna, away from the customers, because customers know that the regular customers would like to taste the best part of the tuna. So, they will try to hide the best tuna from the foreign customers. So now the foreigners appreciate the sushi, especially tuna. They always say tuna, tuna, tuna. They eat tuna only, and they should eat more different kinds of sushi too. But I will not go into more details because my time is running out. So people change, countries change. In Japan, changed too. Now we have improved our relationship with the U.S., which used to be our enemy during the war, and U.S. is our ally. And having had to, fight against the U.S., because we are ally of the United States, the other countries cannot attack Japan, because that means that they would have to then eventually fight against the U.S. And because we cannot maintain our security on our own, and we have to maintain relationship of cooperation and as allies with the United States, and we have to make friendships with other countries too. It doesn't work out if we try to improve our relationship with other countries at the expense of our relationship with the U.S. That doesn't work. If you want to do it, but you cannot do it because you are taking advantage of it. So sometimes that is seen as subjugation to the United States. But I think it's important to maintain the relationship with the United States, and that will be also contributing to maintaining good relationship with China, Russia, and other countries. So Japan should maintain friendly relations with different countries in the world, and that should be the path that Japan should take. And Japan has the longest longevity in the world. In the post-war period, right after the war, it was only 50 years. But last year, in the Day of the Old last year, in 1989, when I became the Minister for Health, centenarians in Japan, I was asked about the number of centenarians in Japan. I answered maybe less than 100, and the answer was no, it was 3,000. That was in 1989. But last year, it surpassed 80,000. 80,000 centenarians living in Japan. So there are so many 80,000 centenarians living in Japan because of the improved diet and the doctors, hospitals. So we have a very good health system, and one of the best in the world. And in the post-war period, since I'm from Yokosuka City, I know this. And there was a dedicated hospital in Yokosuka City for the patients of tuberculosis. We had so many patients of tuberculosis because people were malnourished. So the patients of TB must take good nutrients. In those days, there were so many people who got sick and who had TB because of lack of nutrients. But now, these days, so many people get sick because they take too much nutrients. And as I said before, the sushi is one of the most popular foods in the world, but also whiskey. Whiskey originated in Scotland. But 2 years ago, there was a whiskey tasting competition in Scotland. And from Japan, Suntory and Nikka participated in this. And in that competition, which was held in Scotland, Suntory's and Nikka's whiskeys got the first prizes. That's how Japan got developed. And the Japanese sake is also becoming very popular among foreigners. And in old days, foreigners did not drink sake, but now they think that the sake goes very well with sushi. And now we are exporting sake too. So it's very important that Japan changes itself with the changing times. And I think there is one politician whose records could not be broken, Mr. Yukio Ozaki, whose sculpture who stands just outside of this hall. And this hall is called the Constitutional Memorial Hall, but in the beginning, it was Yukio Ozaki Hall. In 1893, when the parliamentary election was held, he was elected at the age of 22 or 23. And in those days, and even if the changes in the electoral system, he continued to be elected, and he died at the age of 94. So he got elected 25 times, and I got elected 12 times. But this 25 record could not be broken maybe in the future either. And this Yukio Ozaki, who was touted as the god of constitutional politics. And in his memory, this hall was built. And there are words of Yukio Ozaki, which is inscribed on the sculpture. The main stage of a person's life always lies in the future. When he was 94, the year he died. When you are 94 years old, then you will think, I don't care anything about the future. But Mr. Yukio Ozaki wrote these words that the main stage of one's life lies in the future. He wrote this in the year that he was eventually going to die. So he didn't think that it's okay that he was going to die this year, but he didn't think so. So this is phrase from Yukio Ozaki that the main stage of your life will come in the future. This will be my motto. And physically and mentally, you have to make efforts to improve yourself. I'm not sure if I'm going to live until 94, and you are all young from me. So let's get united and let's work together. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We have a surprise today. Former Prime Minister, Mr. Naoto Kan, and also former Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama are with us. How great to see all these former prime ministers together. So please come up to the stage. And this is not the only surprise. It's the former prime ministers, Mr. Koizumi, Mr. Kan, Mr. Hatoyama, and Mr. Murayama, and Mr. Hosokawa. They wrote their own statements for zero nuclear power and renewable energy in their own words. So they released their statements of their own writing. 5 former prime ministers of Japan issued this. Also, so we'd like to get some remarks from them. Yeah, and I share the same press conference with the Mr. Koizumi at the Foreign Correspondence Club of Japan, and at that time we also talked about the denuclearization. But I recently wrote this book, the truth of the nuclear power accident after 10 years, and this book talks about the nuclear power share is only 3%, and the cost of a nuclear power plant has increased 3 times. So in every aspect, nuclear power is over. But this pro-nuclear power people are saying that it's not over, but it's over now. So the agrovoltaics is something that I have been promoting, and we have 4 million hectares of farmland, and we are going to, of course, continue to, make crops on those lands, but we can also set up the photovoltaic panels, and then 500 kilowatts of solar power can be generated per hectare. So, and we have 4 million hectares of land. So altogether, we can produce 2 trillion kilowatts of power from these agrovoltaics. And I was attending the National Memorial Service. That's why I'm wearing black. But Mr. Koizumi told me that we have to live up to 100 so that we can continue working, and I think I will do so. Next is Mr. Yukio Hatoyama, also former prime minister. And I was so pleased to hear Mr. Koizumi for the first time in a long time. So our main stage of our life will come in the future. So that means that Mr. Koizumi will also have to work further and return to the politics, and then create zero nuclear political party and become the party president. Then I will be happy to join it. As Mr. Kan said, I recently wrote a paper. So 2050 carbon neutrality of Japan, that's the aim. And it's not only the denuclearization, but we will phase out fossil fuels too. Then we can achieve this 2050 carbon neutrality. And I use some numbers to prove that it is possible. And if you would like to get a glimpse of it, then you can do so, because I'm distributing a copy right now. One other thing is about tritium, which is now, the government is now trying to discharge it to the sea, to which the fisher folks are opposing, and that will aggravate the already tarnished reputation of Fukushima. And tritium, I think we can come up with a technology which can separate tritium. And now there is an experiment going on, so I think that is possible. And still, the Japanese government seems to have decided to discharge tritium into the sea, but I want them to stop for now, because we should change to the technologies which makes it possible to discharge tritium and the radiation as little as possible. And for that, we need Mr. Koizumi to become, once again, a Prime Minister. So why don't you shake hands, three of you?
Boy, the nuclear village must be feeling very nervous. Thank you very much. So we ask everybody to proceed downstage. We'd like to darken the stage a little bit and take a commemorative photograph. Could we reduce the lighting? These are our former prime ministers who have come back together again to express their concern for Japan. This is how politicians ought to be. Did you take the photographs? Okay. So we'll ask Yue Kimura to continue as MC. Thank you, Kawai-san. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Koizumi. Let's give a warm round of applause to him. Prime Minister Koizumi spoke about Kiyoshi Kurokawa in a different channel at the same time. Mr. Kurokawa gave a lecture at the same time. It's in the archive. It's called, Captivated by Regulation, Kisei no Toriko. So please view Mr. Kurokawa's speech offline. And at the back side of this room, there's a corner where you can pick up leaflets. There is a leaflet about the issue of the spent fuel disposal sites. There is a movie about that. There was an online viewing of that movie about the spent fuel disposal sites. So please take these leaflets as you leave. There are 6 channels online continuing today, so even after you go home, you can look at the contents. You can also refer to the archives. We hope you will enjoy this Nukes Zero, Renewable Energy 100 World Global Conference. We hope this will lead to new action. There are some very important people here today. 10 years ago, when the Fukushima accident occurred, the 7th Fleet of the U.S. was heading towards South Korea at that time. Hearing about the accident, the 2nd Fleet changed its direction and carried out the Tomodachi operation and came on land in Fukushima and was engaged in relief activities. In the midst of the radiation, and these young soldiers in their 20s and 30s were exposed to the radiation as they were doing relief work. Amy explained about that today, about the Tomodachi operation, or Operation Friend. 300 young American soldiers were exposed to radiation, and they've been suffering health effects. Though they were soldiers, some of them are disabled and can't walk anymore, or have eye diseases. And the causes for this were not known at first at the Veterans Hospital. Later on, they realized it was due to the radiation. But once they leave the army, then they no longer get the same benefits. Some of these veterans who were affected by radiation are suffering, I was told. In San Diego, California, some of them are living. So I went to see what their situation is. I was there for 3 nights or 4 days, and I interviewed 10 different soldiers who were exposed to radiation in Fukushima. One of them was in a wheelchair. One of them had lost sight in one eye. Since they'd left the army, they weren't able to go to the hospital regularly either. So a fund was established to support the soldiers who were involved in this Tomodachi operation. I also felt I must do something about this to express our gratitude. So we made an effort to collect 100 million yen to be spent on the medical expenses for these soldiers. We started it from May, and we tried to collect 100 million yen in 9 months. In 2016, whenever I went to a lecture, I asked people to donate to this fund. And at one meeting, the president of Nitori Corporation, Mr. Nitori, came. After hearing about this relief fund for the soldiers in the Tomodachi operation, said he was willing to donate 100 million yen. 100 million yen was our target, but he reached our target just with his donation. We were able to collect a total of 300 million yen in donations, and we sent that money to help support the medical costs for those soldiers who had dedicated themselves for the Fukushima. Thank you for that. The declarations of the prime ministers are available for the media who have registered in advance. The general public will have to access the documents in the archives later on for download. Former Prime Minister Hatayama submitted a article. We have about 30 copies of that, so we will provide that article on a first-come, first-served basis at the reception. So thank you for your participation, and please have safe travels back to your homes.